Hello. Welcome back to U.S. History Lecture Videos. I'm Mrs. Richardson. So today we're picking up where we left off, World War II. All right, so continuing with World War II lessons. We already had a lesson on the origins of World War II and how it began. This lesson is going to focus on what was going on at home in America during World War II and how it changed the nation. So by the end of today's lesson, you should be able to describe the steps taken by the United States to prepare for war, describe how the war changed employment patterns in the United States, discuss the contributions of civilians on the home front, especially women, and analyze how the war affected race relations in the United States. Okay, so while World War II devastated Europe and the Pacific, the United States experienced massive changes at home. The war ended the Great Depression. Many historians agree that that's what officially ended the Great Depression. We don't know what would have happened with the Great Depression if there wasn't a world war. But it solidly ended the Great Depression. And by the time we get to the end of World War II, America's economy is actually booming. Everyday life for Americans began to change. The war provided new opportunities for women, African Americans, and other groups that were previously excluded from good jobs. Because during wartime, right, exceptions were made in which minority groups that might not be allowed in jobs were now allowed in jobs for the sake of the whole country and to support the war effort. Since many of the eligible working men were overseas fighting. However, fear and racism also created deep divisions in American society. So we're going to take a look at how the war affected the entire nation and not just the soldiers. So we talked about Pearl Harbor and the Pearl Harbor attack in our last lesson, right? That's when the United States officially declared war against Japan, and then Japan and its allies declared war against the United States, and all of a sudden we're embroiled in World War II. Before that time, America had once again, just like World War I, tried to remain neutral, but really had been kind of supporting the allies through providing supplies, support, and the president had been kind of working around these neutral laws to try and get weapons, goods, and help to the ally side. But after Japan bombed Pearl Harbor, killing thousands of Americans, destroying much of the U.S. Navy that was stationed at Pearl Harbor, the United States officially declares war. So before Pearl Harbor, the U.S. had already been producing weapons through the cash and carry policy. The Lend-Lease Act in 1941 increased war production even more. So by the time America entered the war, most factories were making civilians goods. So remember, America was this bustling place of industrialization and produced manufactured goods and products. And so the government made a deal with business leaders to switch these civilian products to wartime products. So using America's industrialization and factories to produce war-related goods. The government said, we'll pay all the costs, we'll guarantee your profits, and corporate profits skyrocketed, nearly doubling from $6.4 billion in 1940 to $11 billion in 1944. So this is partly what effectively ended the Great Depression. The top 100 corporations in the United States received about 70% of all government contracts, and so their factories were switched to producing goods that were war-related. All right. And so some examples of that might be a factory that was producing cars is now producing airplane parts, right? Things like that. So building up the army, the draft and the military service, okay? The first peacetime draft in American history began in September of 1940, right? This was a draft to build up the military before we were officially at war. But by December 1941, the United States had only one division ready for combat. Military planners estimated we needed 9 million men to win the war. Over 50 million men registered for the draft during the war, and about 10 million men were actually inducted into military service. So this is millions. We're talking in the millions growth of the U.S. Army for this war. So how did that affect African Americans in the military? About 2.5 million African Americans registered for the draft, and about roughly 1 million served in the military. But initially, they were only allowed in support roles, not in combat roles. But this began to change partly due to just the need. The I never know how to pronounce this. Tuskegee, that's how you do it. Tuskegee Institute trained African Americans as combat pilots. The First Lady, Eleanor Roosevelt, actually visited that school in 1941 and flew with an African American pilot to see their skill and to show public support. The Tuskegee Airmen became one of the most respected units in the military. So by the end of the war, African Americans are serving in infantry and flying positions and sort of working their way up of the social status of the military. Native Americans. About 44,000 Native Americans served in all aspects of the war. Navajo Marines served in communication units in the Pacific and used codes based on their native language that the Japanese people could not break. These code talkers participated in 2 major battles. Comanche code talkers performed similar work in the European section, and these unique contributions helped the Allies win important victories, often overlooked. Now, there were also conscientious objectors, or those who refused to fight. So about 72,000 men registered as conscientious objectors during the war, and all but 20,000 of them were granted that status. Many belonged to pacifist religious groups like Quakers and Mennonites who didn't believe in war or violence or killing. Some accepted non-combative military roles, while others worked in civilian camps without pay. Conscientious objectors were very much discriminated against. The public often was angry with them. Sometimes they were assaulted by strangers. Sometimes their families turned against them for refusing to serve. And only a very small number of men completely avoided the draft entirely. But there were conscientious objectors, and there usually are for every war. All right, so leadership during this time. Who were our major leaders? George Marshall and Dwight Eisenhower. Dwight Eisenhower may be a name if you're familiar with. So President Roosevelt promoted George Marshall to the 4-star general on the day that Germany invaded Poland, so he became one of the leaders. He became Army Chief of Staff and was responsible for training officers. Dwight Eisenhower also rose quickly through the ranks, even though he had never actually seen combat in World War II, so he wasn't as experienced. He became commander of the European theater in June 1942. And so remember, the war was split into different sections. And so the European theater is sort of one whole region in which World War II was being fought. And there were other theaters or sections. And that were the leadership and battle tactics were different in each section. Because it was a world war. It wasn't just fought in one place. We had troops in multiple countries at the same time fighting multiple aspects of the war. So these leaders and others created military commands and that could win the confidence of American soldiers, right? Strong, confident, communicative, and skilled leaders made all the difference in the war. So as those leaders are fighting at home, things continue to change. So we talked just briefly about Native American involvement, African American involvement. We're going to get to women's involvement. Migration and employment changes. So remember, with 9 to 10 million men joining the army instead of working, all of their jobs needed to be filled, especially since the United States was now shifting to manufacturing wartime goods. So thousands of Americans moved to the West Coast to work in defense plants and shipyards. Richmond, California, a town in California, grew from 20,000 people to 5 times that in just 3 years. African Americans migrated from the rural South to the northern and western coast cities, which was continuation of earlier waves of African migration. Women also relocated to follow their husbands to military bases or take defense industry jobs. This is also not as much talked about in this lesson, but this is where we're going to see sort of the beginning of daycare as we know it today, because so many women were working in factories supporting the work effort that their children would then be unsupervised. And so we started to see neighborhood women kind of banding together where 1 or 2 women or a woman and an older sister of a family would work together to watch multiple families' children while the other women would go off and work. And this was publicly supported, socially supported, in a way that it would never have been before due to community effort to win the war. The government pretty heavily stepped into the economy. Roosevelt created the Office of Price Administration, which regulated prices and tried to prevent inflation during the war. The government had the power to set cap prices on all goods except farm products. Major labor unions promised not to strike in order to keep production moving. So all of the things that sort of divided the country before, while still there, were often kind of blanketed under the we are all working together to win this war effort. And then you'll see after the war, all of those issues come to the surface again. In return for not striking, the government helped workers bargain for better wages and introduced the tax withholding system that we still use today. Americans also were allowed to purchase war bonds as an investment and, again, as a way to support their country. And Americans purchased over $185 billion worth of war bonds. And, so sort of this way of giving the government money and the government promising to pay it back with interest later on. It was an investment for Americans and also a way for the government to raise the revenue that it needed to fund the war effort. On the home front, the government also issued ration booklets to limit how much people could buy. So ration items include things like meat, coffee, butter, sugar, shoes, liquor, cigarettes, gasoline. Many Americans would only drive their cars on certain days of the week. The government encouraged Americans to plant what they called victory gardens, right? Grow your own food to make your rations go further so that more of those food supplies could be sent overseas to support the war effort. People recycled, conserved, participated in scrap drive. Children collected metal, paper, rubber, old rags. And there was even a black market that popped up where people illegally bought and sold ration goods. So it directly affected people at home. All right, shifting to women. Right. The departure of soldiers created a huge gap in the labor force. As I've mentioned, we're talking 9 to 10 million men. And even though African Americans stepped up to take their jobs as well, so did millions of women. By 1943, the majority of aircraft industry workers were women, and women were able to move into jobs that were previously thought only men could do. The government supported this. They created propaganda featuring this poster, Rosie the Riveter, right? Showing the strength of a young woman, saying women can do it, working in traditionally male jobs, riveting plane parts together. So Rosie was shown as tough but still feminine to reassure men about women working, to keep men secure. And believe it or not, some factories actually gave women lessons in makeup to keep them looking feminine, and cosmetics or makeup were never rationed during the war. So it was this government supported, women can go to work, but they still need to be women so that the men aren't threatened. But as I mentioned, many of these people were also mothers. So 33% of the people working were moms. These women worked double day shifts at the plants and then at home. And although they earned more money than I ever had before, they were still paid less than the men. And so First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt pushed for the first government child care facilities. And in 1942, the Community Facilities Act was passed, which created 7 child care centers serving 105,000 children. Many mothers still lacked childcare. They had to leave children locked in their cars during work. Police reported increases in juvenile delinquency. And sometimes these working mothers were blamed, which of course is ridiculous, right? Because they're being told that they need to work to support the country. So, as I mentioned, something that's not always talked about is like women started to band together to help themselves, where women who couldn't work or one woman on the street who might not be working would help watch all of the children on the street, again supported often by like older daughters in the families who weren't working, and that was the way that they were supposed to be serving their country. Women also served in the military directly, often and typically working as nurses, truck drivers, airplane mechanics, or clerical workers. Over 1,600 women nurses received decorations for their courage under fire, and many women nurses died or were captured in war zones. Thousands of women also worked as chemists and engineers developing weapons, and many women were recruited to work on the Manhattan Project, which was the development of the atomic or nuclear bomb. A nuclear bomb is what's going to technically officially end part of the war, but we'll get to that in another lesson. So, morale, how did you keep things positive? Well, by 1941, there were more movie theaters than banks in the United States, and so movies provided escape. This is where people could go and take a break. Newsreels shown before the movies would inform Americans about the war. Documentaries were created about why we were fighting. By 1945, when the war is really at its height, movie attendance reached an all-time high. And so even those working as Hollywood stars were often told that by creating these movies, they too were supporting the war effort by providing much needed breaks for women workers, African American workers, even soldiers overseas. They could then stream a movie and just have one little bit of normalcy. All right, let's see. couple more slides here. So racial tensions. African Americans wanted their service to earn them better opportunities and equal treatment. And there was pushback for this. In 1941, a labor leader threatened to march on Washington. President Roosevelt signed an executive order creating the Fair Employment Practices Committee, which tried to stop racial discrimination in defense industries. However, African Americans were often hired for the lowest paying non-skilled positions. So we see this kind of battle between much of society not wanting to end racial discrimination and the government trying to bring a stop to it, especially during wartime effort. So despite African American patriotism, there's a lot of racial violence erupting in various cities as African Americans moved into closer contact with white people and became more involved in what had typically been white sections of cities. Because of the war effort, they stepped in. There were also riots and conflict between Americans and Mexican Americans during the war. Various programs brought thousands of Mexican workers in to help replace American men who had gone overseas. And again, these Mexican Americans were brought in to keep these defense sort of producing, again, if you're a riveter, right, like you're riveting together pieces of metal potentially for a plane, we needed people to do that work. And so the country started pooling its minority resources, people who were previously excluded from this, and that included African Americans, Native Americans, women, Mexican Americans. And again, sort of a similar situation with African Americans is the people who had already been there and who were white, typically, were not okay with this. Native born Americans called Mexican Americans unpatriotic. For wearing something called zoot suits, right, which was just kind of like their distinctive style. But Native-born Americans were saying you're using too much fabric, you should be conserving. And then Mexican American men are retaliating, and so we get riots and violence happening, specifically in Southern California. All right, and the last thing that I want to talk about today is Japanese American internment. This is often referred to as America's wartime shame, because after Pearl Harbor was bombed by the Japanese, racist assumptions ran wild about Japanese Americans, right? So, Japanese people who had been living in America perhaps for multiple generations. And the president actually signed an executive order that allowed the army to remove people from military areas and relocate them to internment camps. And so about 120,000 people who had Japanese ancestry were relocated to internment camps and kept there for the vast majority of the war because they were not trusted because of their racial history, even though 66% of them had been born in the United States. And so this discrimination is one of America's wartime shames because they were sent to various camps. Families were separated, and the camps were horrible. They're overcrowded, heavily guarded, barbed wire. People were not always fed enough. But Japanese Americans tried to build communities and resume normal life, waiting for the war to end. No Japanese American who was sent to a camp was ever found guilty of sabotage or espionage, ever. And in addition to that, about 16,000 Germans and 2,300 Italian Americans were also interned. But that was a much smaller percentage of their population, so it's not always highlighted. But fear and racism led to these internment camps. But many Japanese Americans wanted to enlist in the military. Draft boards often classified them as undesirable aliens, even if they were American born. But as the war continued, some were reclassified due to the desperate need. And nearly 33,000 Japanese Americans served in the military during the war. They proved their loyalty and courage despite the internment of most of their people or even themselves. And their success showed how unjustified the internment policy was, because even after being interned, many Japanese Americans still wanted to serve their country, the country that was mistreating them, which was really a credit to Japanese Americans. So some reflection questions to think about. How did World War II change American society? What surprised you most about the experience of women, African Americans, or other groups, Mexican Americans, Japanese Americans? How do you think the war impacted the home front? How do you think the war's impact on the home front affected America after the war ended? Was the United States truly united during the war? Or do we just cover up our deep divisions? And so on. So we're going to stop there for today.